In the summer of 1997, the town of Mill Creek, nestled deep in the heart of rural Kansas, moved at the pace of sunrises and harvest seasons. It was a patchwork of wheat fields, dirt roads, and century-old barns that stood like stubborn old men weathered by time. The Carter family had lived on their 140-acre farm just outside the county line for 3 generations. It wasn't a place that changed quickly, or welcomed change at all. That July, the wheat was tall and golden, swaying in dry heat like waves on a landlocked sea. Dust clung to the air, and the sound of cicadas filled the gaps between conversations. Everyone in Mill Creek knew everyone. That was the kind of place it was. Annalise Carter, 21, was the only daughter of Ruth and Daniel Carter, a girl born of the land, molded by it. She woke before dawn, tended livestock with her father, and helped her mother can peaches and pick tomatoes when the sun hung low. She was strong but quiet, private but kind, known for her sun-hardened hands and the thick braid that trailed down her back. People said she was dependable, with a calm steadiness like the ticking of an old wall clock. On July 19th, a Saturday, Annalise stayed behind to tend the southern field while her parents drove into town for the weekly farmers market. Her older brother was away at college in Wichita, and it was one of the few times she was alone on the property. The field she worked in lay furthest from the farmhouse, a low, sloping stretch that ended in a line of dense trees and a rusted fence that hadn't been mended in years. The soil there was stubborn, but Annalise never minded. She took with her a jug of well water, a lunch tray wrapped in cloth, and an old curved sickle, a hand tool passed down from her grandfather. The family hadn't used mechanical harvesters in years. They believed in doing things the old way. Around 1:30 p.m., a Neja, HBOR named Judith Haller passed by on the gravel road returning from town. She slowed her pickup, squinting toward the southern acreage. There in the shimmering heat, she saw Annalise, standing alone in the waist-high grain, her sickle glinting under the sun. Judith waved. Annalise didn't wave back. She just stood there for a moment, then turned away toward the trees. That was the last time anyone saw her. By late afternoon, Ruth and Daniel returned to find the farmhouse still and empty. The front door was unlocked, the lunch tray untouched on the kitchen counter. Her boots weren't by the back door. Her water jug was gone. Initially, they assumed she'd lost track of time, but when the sun began to dip and the sky bled orange across the fields, concern took root. Daniel headed toward the southern field, expecting to see her walking back along the tractor path. Instead, he found the sickle lying in the grass. The water jug was tipped over, half empty, but no Annalise. They searched until dark, calling her name through the tall wheat, lighting the way with flashlights. At midnight, they called the sheriff. The sheriff's department responded the next morning with 2 deputies and a bloodhound. They walked the fields, checked her room, questioned the neighbors. No tire tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication of where she had gone. By the second day, rumors had begun to swell, quietly but unmistakably. She ran off, one woman at the post office said, maybe to start over somewhere. Maybe she had a secret boyfriend, someone else muttered at the diner. Girls that age, you never know. The official report was inconclusive. No foul play suspected, no leads, no witnesses beyond Judith's brief sighting. The sheriff's deputy, a man named Craig Monroe, made a note in the file. Possible voluntary disappearance, no immediate signs of distress. But Ruth Carter stood in front of the town hall meeting that Thursday, her voice low but unwavering. She would never leave the land, not without telling us, not without her boots. By the end of the week, search parties had combed the woods. Flyers were posted at gas stations and grain co-ops. A few local news crews did small segments. Missing farm girl sparks concern in Mill Creek. Then came the silence, the kind that settles like dust after the storm of attention passes. And just as the town began to exhale, something was found. 7 days after Annalise vanished, her younger cousin Ellie was walking the lower path through the field, cutting across to bring eggs from her mother's coop. Her shoe snagged something. When she looked down, she saw it, a single canvas work shoe, barely visible among the stalks. It was Annalise's, worn down at the heel, lace-frayed, the pair she always wore into the fields. The other was never found. The sheriff's office came back out. They flagged the area, brought in a few cadaver dogs, but the trail was already cold and the fields were due to be harvested soon. The only thing they found was more soil and more questions. To Ruth and Daniel, it was confirmation. Their daughter had not run. She had not vanished willingly. Something had taken her, or someone. But without a body, or a note, or even a second footprint. The town moved on. The wheat was harvested. The sickle was boxed away. Her room stayed as it was, untouched. And somewhere, out in the field where the wind blew and the earth held its secrets, the land remembered. In the months that followed Annalise Carter's disappearance, the town of Mill Creek shifted from concern to cautious distance, the kind reserved for things that couldn't be explained. At first, there were candlelight vigils, flyers tacked to telephone poles, volunteers walking side by side in the wheat fields, calling her name like it might summon her back. The Carters kept hope alive through sheer will. Ruth baked bread each morning, just in case Annalise came home hungry. Aniel repainted the barn's old door, muttering that it needed to look right when she returned. They made sure the porch light stayed on every night, the kind of hope that aches in silence. But hope has a short shelf life in small towns. Weeks became seasons. Seasons became years. The flyers faded. The search parties disbanded. People stopped asking. By the time winter rolled in, whispers filled the void left by the unanswered questions. She was too smart to stay here forever. I heard she had a fight with her parents. There were always rumors about that farmhand they let go the year before. Others weren't so subtle. She ran off, got tired of dirt and dust. Who wouldn't? The sheriff's department followed every lead they could, but there were no fingerprints, no blood, no signs of forced entry or violence, just an empty field, a found shoe, and a family left to sit with questions that yielded no answers. Deputy Craig Monroe, then in his mid-30s, was the only one who didn't check the final box. He pushed back when they filed it as a likely runaway. She didn't take money. She didn't pack. She left her boots. But he was outranked. The official line was that there was no clear evidence of foul play. So the file was boxed, numbered, and shelved. Case number 97419. Ruth Carter carried that box in her heart. Every grocery trip became a scan for familiar faces. Every little girl she passed reminded her of the one who never came home. She started keeping a journal. Each entry began the same way. Day, Botin, without Annalise. In 2001, Ruth was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She fought hard, quietly, with the same resolve she once used to raise chickens and stitch curtains. But when the end came, she asked for only one thing: to be buried with a photo of Annalise, the one taken when she turned 18, framed in a simple locket. Daniel Carter did not speak at the funeral. He stood beside her grave with his hat in his hands and his face to the ground. When people came to offer condolences, he only nodded, as though too much had been said already. After Ruth's passing, Daniel changed. He stopped attending church. He rarely left the farm. He let the southern field grow wild, refusing to plant or harvest. That land already took enough, he'd say to the few who asked. The field became a patch of overgrown memory, brittle weeds, tangled grasses, and silence. By 2005, the town had all but moved on. The case of Annalise Carter was no longer spoken of at the diner or whispered about at the post office. A few new families moved into town and didn't even know her name. But not everyone forgot. That year, her brother Ethan, now 26, recently returned from college, built a bench near the edge of the southern field where her shoe had been found. It was simple. Weathered wood, no inscription, just a place to sit and look out over the land that once raised them both. He didn't say much about it, just told his father, "She deserves something that won't fade." Daniel never sat on the bench, but each morning when he passed it on his way to the barn, he tipped his hat, just once, every day. As time wore on, the weight of the mystery settled into the soil like old roots. By 2010, the Carters were an afterthought in Mill Creek. The field had long stopped producing. The barn was beginning to sag. People referred to the farm as that place with the girl who disappeared. Deputy Craig Monroe, now nearing retirement, still kept her file in his desk drawer, the only one not stored in archives. He reread it once a year, usually in July. There was something about the timeline that never sat right with him. Judith Haller's account of Annalise standing in the field, it was too specific, too firm. She'd said Annalise turned toward the tree line, but the sheriff had ruled out the woods early on, claiming dogs would have picked up a scent. But Craig had walked those woods himself. He remembered the thick canopy, the old storm altar entrance no one had thought to open. Still, without new evidence, it stayed cold. Until one afternoon in the fall of 2010, Craig received a letter in his mailbox. No return address, just a single sentence written on lined notebook paper. You searched the house, but never the earth. There was no name, no date, but it reignited something in him. He brought the file back out, pinned the photos on the wall of his garage, and for the first time in years, he called Daniel Carter. "I want to come walk the property again," he said. Daniel paused. "It won't bring her back." "I know," Craig said, "but it might help me understand." Daniel agreed. The next morning, Craig stood at the edge of the southern field, hands in his jacket pockets, staring at the bench Ethan built. He closed his eyes and whispered, "We missed something. I know we did." And from that moment, the silence began to stir, not loudly, but enough to shift the dust. Because one man never let the case go, and he was ready to start asking again. The years were unkind to the Carter farm. After Daniel passed in 2013, the property was left in legal limbo. Ethan, now living 2 towns over with a family of his own, couldn't afford to maintain it. The house was boarded up. The land sat untouched, a forgotten patch of golden brush in a world that no longer remembered who it belonged to. In early spring of 2016, a regional agribusiness corporation, Meadow Pine Co-op, acquired a number of old properties across the county. Their plan was simple: convert neglected land into large-scale crop operations. Efficiency over history. No one in town blinked when the old Carter farm showed up on that list. 2 months later, Meadow Pine sent out one of their new land surveyors to conduct soil analysis and prepare plots for modern irrigation infrastructure. His name was Tyler Griggs, 32 years old, recently transferred from an urban district. He knew little about Mill Creek beyond what was printed on old plot maps. It was just another job. Tyler spent 2 days marking grid lines, drilling shallow cores, noting terrain anomalies. On the third morning, under a sky the color of steel, he launched his personal drone to capture aerial footage of the property's south side. The drone buzzed overhead, its camera gliding over the brittle, sun-bleached grass of the southern field, the very land Daniel Carter had refused to till for nearly 2 decades. Tyler watched the monitor on his tablet as the drone hovered. He tapped the screen, adjusting its angle. That's when it happened. A sudden drop in elevation, a gust of wind or maybe a battery issue, and the drone spiraled. It clipped a branch and disappeared into the overgrowth. Tyler muttered under his breath and trudged toward the coordinates, GPS ping blinking in his hand. The brush was thicker here, unkempt. The air felt heavier. It took him 10 minutes to find the drone, wedged beside a half-rotted fence post, its blades still. But just as he bent to retrieve it, he saw something else. A curve of rusted metal, barely visible through the soil. At first he thought it was part of the fence, but as he brushed it off, the shape became clearer. A half-moon blade, curved and corroded, its handle worn to splinters, and snagged on the metal, a strip of blue fabric, caught like a flag half buried. Tyler stood there for a moment, confused. It didn't match any current farming tools, and something about the scene felt off. He took a photo with his phone, marked the GPS coordinates, and logged the find. Then, something in his gut told him to report it. That afternoon, he emailed the image and location to the Mill Creek Police Department, not expecting much. But the moment Detective Craig Monroe opened the attachment, his pulse stopped cold. He knew that sickle. He'd seen it in the old Carter family photos, in Ruth's journal, in the evidence photos taken back in '97, Annalise using it, holding it awkwardly, but proudly. It was hers. Monroe drove out that same evening. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the field. Tyler met him by the survey stakes and walked him to the spot. Together, they knelt beside the unearthed sickle. It wasn't just rusted. It was pitted, as if time had tried to erase it. But the handle, though faded, still had a faint carving along its length. AC, just barely visible. Craig touched it gently, as if afraid it might vanish again. "This is it," he whispered. "This belonged to her." Within 24 hours, the site was marked off with yellow tape. Forensic teams arrived from the county. Soil specialists began to analyze the top layers for anomalies. What they found was chilling. The area surrounding the sickle had been disturbed. At some point in the past 20 years, the soil had been dug up, turned over, and recompacted. But it hadn't been tilled by equipment. It was done by hand, carefully, like someone had tried to bury something and erase it. Tyler, shaken but curious, provided all the drone data he had, including flight paths and footage. In one grainy clip from before the crash, investigators noticed a strange depression pattern, almost circular, just 10 feet from the sickle. They flagged it, and Monroe, standing at the edge of the flagged area, whispered to himself, "We were standing on it the whole time." He called Ethan Carter personally. They met on the porch of Ethan's home that night. Ethan listened in silence as Monroe described the discovery. "It's been 19 years, Ethan said quietly. "We stopped asking for answers a long time ago." Monroe shook his head, but the field didn't forget. The next day, lab confirmation came through. The sickle was a match. The wooden grip still held trace particles of Annalise's DNA, old, degraded, but enough. The case was reopened. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the town of Mill Creek had to say her name again. Annalise Carter. Not the missing girl, not the whisper in wheat fields, but a real person with a story that wasn't finished. And in that southern field, the one her father refused to touch, the one people had avoided for so long, something buried was ready to be found. Detective Craig Monroe hadn't set foot in an active investigation in nearly 6 years. After retiring from full-time service, he'd taken a quiet position as a consultant, reviewing cold cases when the department had the budget, or the will, to reopen them. But this wasn't cold anymore. When the sickle was confirmed to belong to Annalise Carter, something in Monroe shifted. A quiet ignition. The case he had never truly let go, the one that had followed him like a ghost, was stirring again. The morning after the forensic team flagged the disturbed soil near the southern field, Monroe stood in the middle of it, boots pressed into earth that had once held secrets. Around him, yellow tape fluttered gently in the wind. He kept replaying the old reports in his mind. Something never quite added up. The timeline: Annalise was last seen around noon by Mr. Darrell Quaid, a farmer who lived a mile south. He claimed she was walking toward the barbed wire fence line that separated her land from the Breyer property. That sighting had placed her in a particular quadrant of the field. But the clock always bothered Monroe. Darrell said it was close to lunch, yet Annalise's lunch tray was still untouched when her parents returned. It didn't make sense, unless she never made it back to eat, or unless someone else saw her first. With fresh authorization under the reopened case, Monroe requested a full re-interview of every person originally questioned in 1997. One by one, those now older residents sat down again in the sheriff's office, repeating stories they had convinced themselves were closed chapters. But one name raised the hairs on Monroe's neck: Elliot Breyer. He had lived in a crumbling house behind the Hills Bores, nearing the Carters' southern acreage. Back then, Elliot had been in his early 30s, quiet, solitary, and prone to anger. He owned 2 aging pickup trucks, bred hunting dogs, and rarely left the property. In 1997, Elliot had claimed he spent the day of Annalise's disappearance hauling scrap metal to Lincoln. He even presented a signed slip from a salvage yard. But Monroe had always wondered about the time stamp. The receipt said 2:48 p.m., well after Annalise vanished. Technically, it gave him an alibi, but not for noon. Monroe asked for the old interview tapes to be pulled. In the original footage, Elliot was defensive, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The way he answered every question with another question, the subtle sarcasm, the impatience, it all came rushing back. Now, nearly 20 years later, Monroe decided it was time to knock on his door again. The Breyer house hadn't changed. Still weather-beaten, still missing shingles. The screen door squeaked open with the same rusty protest. Elliot, now gray and slightly hunched, answered the door in silence. "I remember you," he said after a long pause. "You were the one who kept sniffing around like I had something to do with it." Monroe kept his voice calm. "Mind if we talk?" They sat outside on a porch covered in dust and unused fishing gear. Elliot lit a cigarette and stared out at the horizon. "I've already told you people everything," he muttered, "back then and 5 times after." "You told us you were in Lincoln that day," Monroe said, "but the salvage yard was over 2 hours away. You didn't clock in there until nearly 3. That leaves about 5 hours unaccounted for." Elliot narrowed his eyes. "So what? I stopped for lunch, took the long route." "Did you?" Monroe asked, reaching into his satchel, "because this photo says otherwise." He pulled out a blown-up image, recently enhanced from an old community fair flyer. In the background, barely visible, but unmistakably clear once zoomed, was a red pickup truck with a faded blue decal. Elliot's truck, parked near the Carter fence line. The photo was time-stamped 12:16 p.m., July 22, 1997, the same day Annalise vanished. Elliot's jaw tensed. He stood abruptly, flicking his cigarette onto the dirt. "I want a lawyer," he said. Monroe didn't stop him. He didn't have to. Back at the station, the lab called. The fabric found snagged on the sickle. It had DNA. Not just partial, a full mitochondrial profile. But the match wasn't Annalise. It was someone else entirely. Female, Hispanic origin, approximate age, early 20s. No match in national databases. No match to anyone in the town registry. An unknown woman. A second woman. Monroe stared at the lab results, heart thudding. That field had kept more than one secret. He pulled the town records again, this time focusing on missing persons reports from the year before Annalise vanished. There wasn't much, but buried in an archived agricultural permit was a brief mention of a migrant worker, a seasonal farmhand hired under the table by the Breyer family in 1996. Her name was Carmen Rizzo. She had never been formally reported missing, because, as Monroe feared, no one cared enough to notice. He contacted immigration liaisons, farm worker protection agencies, and local church groups that had offered aid in the 90s. One nun recalled a young woman named Carmen, sweet, always humming. She had vanished one day in late September 1996. Elliot Breyer had come by the shelter days later, claiming she'd moved on to California. No one questioned it. Monroe closed the binder slowly, the weight of history pressing down. 2 women. One known, one almost forgotten, and one man at the center of it all. The town of Mill Creek had long kept its silences, but the land hadn't. The soil gave back what time tried to bury, and for the first time in 2 decades, they had a name no one expected. Carmen Rizzo. And a quest. And more disturbing than before. How many secrets were buried out there, and how long had the town looked away? Tyler Griggs hadn't expected much when he returned to the field. His drone's crash had been random, and finding the sickle, old, rusted, and half-swallowed by the earth, had already felt like a one-in-a-million moment. But something about the place pulled at him, not fear, not even curiosity. More like unfinished business. The old Carter farm had been sold off in patches after the 2008 recession. Corporations had bought out land from aging farmers, eager to expand operations, but the southern field, where Annalise Carter vanished, had remained oddly untouched. Officially, it was flagged as low yield. Unofficially, the locals still whispered about it. Nothing grows right there. Machines stall near the back lot. Animals don't go near the fence. Tyler, a seasoned land surveyor in his early 30s, wasn't one for ghost stories. But as he stood again on the uneven ridge where the sickle had surfaced, a cold breeze ran along his spine, too sharp for a late August evening. He came alone this time. No crew, no equipment, just a flashlight, a ground-penetrating radar scanner, and the memory of the frayed fabric caught on metal. It was nearly dusk when the scanner beeped, twice. He stopped. The signals weren't near the drone crash site. They were closer to the tree line, where tall grasses grew wild, masking uneven earth. Kneeling down, Tyler brushed away weeds, revealing something strange. A squared outline, about 3 feet across, with the faintest edge of corroded metal peeking through the dirt. He paused. The shape looked deliberate, old, like a trap door. He hesitated, listening. The field was silent. Grabbing a pry bar from his truck, Tyler worked at the edge, pushing against rusted hinges. The ground gave slowly, groaning in protest, until the door creaked open to reveal a short ladder descending into darkness. A root cellar, unmarked, unlisted on any recent farm maps. The air that rose was damp and metallic, laced with rot. He aimed his flashlight inside. The walls were stone, curved and low. Moisture glistened off the edges. Dirt lined the floor. But it wasn't empty. Near the back, beneath an overturned crate and a collapsed wooden beam, were personal items, clothing, mold-ridden bedding, and a scattering of torn notebook pages. Tyler stepped back, heart pounding. He dialed 911. Within the hour, Deputy Monroe arrived on site, flashlight in hand. He climbed into the cellar silently. Tyler stood above, watching the beam of light flicker along the walls. Then Monroe's voice echoed up, low and grim. "Call the coroner and forensic team." By morning, yellow tape circled the field again, for the second time in nearly 20 years. Inside the cellar, investigators recovered 2 decomposed sets of human remains, a tattered journal, water-damaged but partially legible, a small child's bracelet with beads spelling ANA, several strands of long human hair wrapped around an old nail on the wall. The first body, positioned near the wall, was identified quickly. Annalise Carter. Dental records confirmed it. Her skeleton bore signs of blunt trauma to the skull and defensive wounds to the arms. But the second body, also female, estimated to be early 20s, was still awaiting DNA confirmation. Monroe didn't need the test. He already knew. Carmen Rizzo. The woman no one had reported missing. The girl who vanished a year before Annalise. The girl who had lived and died in silence. But it was the journal that broke Monroe's resolve. Pages were water-streaked, many torn or faded, but certain lines stood clear. He says no one will hear me here. The door locks from the outside. She cries at night. I try to comfort her. I heard a truck. I screamed. No one came. He brought another girl. I don't know her name. If you're reading this, please tell my mom I didn't run away. The handwriting varied. 2 distinct styles, one slanted and large, one small and rounded. 2 girls, trapped, buried in the same ground they worked. The root cellar hadn't just been a hiding place. It had been a prison. Monroe walked the field slowly, sunlight flickering through the rustling grain. He stopped near the lunch tray, still marked in the police report, 23 feet from where the sickle had been found. He imagined her there, alone, hungry, hearing a truck, turning. Then, silence. He sat on the old wooden bench, the one Annalise's brother had built in 2005. It faced the horizon, the same view Annalise once saw each morning. He whispered aloud, though no one else was near. We let the land carry the secret, and it waited until someone finally asked again. That night, news spread through Mill Creek like wildfire. A newscaster summarized the shocking find. 2 bodies, 1 cold case reopened, 1 silent victim finally named. But for those who knew the names, who carried the weight of the whispers for years, it wasn't news, it was vindication. Monroe stood outside the Breyer property the next day, warrant in hand. The man who once mocked the investigation had vanished, truck gone, house abandoned, but not for long. Because now, the town knew, and the land had spoken. The news of 2 bodies discovered in the root cellar beneath the southern field hit Mill Creek like a thunderclap. Locals gathered in hushed circles outside the church, at the diner, at the feed store. Conversations that once carefully tiptoed around the past now flooded into the open, tangled in grief, shock, and denial. Most had assumed the Carter girl was long gone, that she'd left town, maybe ended her life or been taken far away. But no one was ready for the second body, not even Monroe. Within 72 hours, the second victim was identified by the state forensic lab. Carmen Rizzo, age 23, missing since late summer of 1996. She was never officially reported. Her name had barely made it into local papers, filed under possible migrant transient. She was one of the many seasonal workers who rotated through the Midwest during harvest, often underpaid, overworked, and undocumented. The Rizzo family, contacted through church records and immigration aid groups, lived 2 counties east. They had waited years in silence, convinced Carmen had died alone somewhere far from home. But Carmen had died here, beneath a field no one thought to search, in a town that quietly buried more than crops. And now secrets were starting to rot at the roots. Deputy Monroe sat in the dusty records room, flipping through an old employment ledger from the Breyer farm. He found Carmen's name scrawled in faded pencil, sandwiched between 2 others, both crossed out. No last date of work, no address listed. Elliot Breyer, the quiet, reclusive farmer whose land bordered the Carter property, had submitted a statement in 1997. He'd claimed to be out of town the day Annalise vanished, backed by a vague receipt from a nearby hardware store. But Monroe had always been uneasy about that timeline, and now he had proof. A recently discovered town fair photo from July 17, 1997, the day Annalise disappeared. The picture, submitted by a local newspaper photographer digitizing his archives, showed Elliot's truck. Unmistakable rust pattern along the passenger door, parked less than 400 feet from the Carter field. A false alibi. Monroe took the photo and drove to the county judge that same afternoon. By nightfall, a search warrant was signed. The Breyer house was abandoned. Elliot had vanished days earlier, the moment the seller made headlines. Inside, dust clung to every surface. The refrigerator was empty. The water had been shut off for months. But in a locked cabinet in the basement, they found what Monroe feared: recordings. Old VHS tapes, some unlabeled, others marked only by initials. Among them, one dated CR, July 96, another, CHA, AC, fence fix. No one spoke as they loaded the evidence bags. The tapes were turned over to state investigators. Their contents would not be described publicly, only summarized later in court filings as evidence of unlawful captivity, coercion, and post-mortem concealment. Monroe sat outside the Breyer property long after nightfall, porch light flickering in the breeze. He thought of Annalise, of Carmen, of every moment missed while the town went quiet. Back in town, silence began to crack. An older woman named Lorraine Jennings, who had lived near the southern field since the 70s, approached the sheriff's office unprompted. Hands shaking, she recalled a night in 1996 when she'd heard screams coming from the fields. She told her husband. He told her not to get involved. He said girls like that didn't belong here anyway, she admitted, voice low, eyes wet. So I stayed inside. Another neighbor recalled seeing Carmen once, standing at the edge of the road near Breyer's barn. She waved at me, just once. I thought maybe she needed help, but I didn't stop. I didn't want trouble. The shame hung thick in the room. In the weeks that followed, other whispers emerged, mostly from those who had known Elliot Breyer long before he turned inward. He had been odd, possessive, known for keeping to himself. His father, long since deceased, had been a powerful landowner, a donor to city council campaigns, a vocal opponent of outsiders. One man, a retired pastor, confessed to Monroe, "Elliot's father once said to me, 'We keep things in this town under control, because if we don't, they'll come and take it all.' Control, secrets, silence." Mill Creek had protected its own for too long. Forensic teams confirmed Annalise's cause of death: blunt force trauma consistent with the recovered sickle. Carmen's injuries were harder to read, but signs of restraint were evident. Together their deaths painted a picture not just of a predator, but of a community that looked away. Monroe, preparing the official statement for state prosecutors, included one line that lingered. This wasn't a single act of violence. It was years of silence, stitched into every fence post and fall harvest. The press arrived soon after, circling the story like vultures. Small-town secrets explode after cold case breakthrough. 2 women, 1 cellar, decades of silence. But Monroe didn't care for the headlines. He thought of Grace Carter, Annalise's mother, who had passed before ever knowing the truth. He thought of Carmen's family, forced to bury their daughter 20 years too late. And he thought of that cellar. How quiet it must have been. How dark. How no one ever walked close enough to hear. Cliffhanger. Buried in the back of the Carter family's barn, sealed inside an old storage chest beneath hay and broken tools, was something no one had seen in decades. Annalise's camera. Old, dusty, and still holding a roll of undeveloped film. Inside it, perhaps, one final glimpse into the days before she vanished. By the spring of 2017, the courtroom in Mill Creek was packed daily, not just with reporters and camera crews, but with residents who had once claimed to know nothing at all. It was standing room only on the day Elliot Breyer was brought in, wearing a wrinkled orange jumpsuit, head low, eyes unmoved. The courtroom fell silent. For a man who had spent decades hiding behind fences and silence, he now stood at the center of it all. The charges were read aloud. 2 counts of murder, 1 count of unlawful imprisonment, tampering with evidence, concealment of a corpse, false statements to law enforcement. The list went on, each word echoed like a hammer strike. The prosecutor presented the case in quiet, deliberate strokes, never theatrical, never rushed. The evidence was overwhelming, the fabric with non-Annalise DNA, the VHS tapes, the cellar remains, and most hauntingly, the journal fragments discovered beneath the field. Annalise's writing, faded but legible, had been verified by handwriting experts and matched known samples from her school years. Pages of it were read aloud in court, while her father, seated in the front row, gripped the bench until his knuckles turned white. He says the field is our silence, that no one can hear through the dirt. Carmen doesn't speak anymore. I try not to either. If I forget the sky, I forget my name. So I whisper it, every night. My name is Annalise. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. When Carmen Rizzo's younger sister, Lucia, took the stand, her voice trembled, but her words never faltered. We were always told to keep our heads down, not to cause trouble, she said, that no one would believe us anyway. But Carmen was brave. She went to work far from home because she wanted to help. She never came back. For years we didn't even have a place to leave flowers. She placed a small weathered photo of Carmen on the ledge beside the witness stand. The defense attorney didn't try to claim Elliot was innocent, only that he was deeply disturbed, shaped by his controlling father and mental illness. But the jury didn't buy it. The acts were too calculated, the evidence too damning. And then came Noah Carter, Annalise's brother. Now in his early 30s, Noah wore a dark suit, hair graying early at the temples, voice steady but low. He took the stand and looked directly at Elliot. You told everyone she ran, he said, but you knew where she was. You let us walk through harvests, holidays, winters, wondering. You let my mother die without an answer. Noah paused, swallowed, continued. People say the field was haunted, that it had a heaviness to it, but it wasn't haunted. It was just quiet, because we let it be. Gasps stirred in the gallery. And with that, the silence of Mill Creek was finally named for what it was. The trial lasted just over 3 weeks. The verdict came back in 2 hours. Guilty, on all counts. Elliot Breyer was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and taken out of the courtroom in cuffs, passing by faces that once politely nodded at him in the grocery store. Outside, locals gathered around the courthouse steps, watching the press snap photos and broadcast updates. But there were no cheers, no celebration, only long, aching breaths, as if the town had been holding them for 20 years. In the weeks following the trial, the Carter family's southern field was officially deemed a historic memorial site. The state provided funds for cleanup and preservation. The cellar was filled and sealed. A modest wooden fence was built around the perimeter with a single plaque placed at the entrance. It read, "In memory of Annalise Carter and Carmen Rizzo, stolen from their lives, never from our hearts. May we never let silence grow where truth should speak. A tree was planted nearby, a bench added beside the one Noah had placed years before. Fresh wildflowers were replanted each season by volunteers. People came from out of town, some out of guilt, others out of solidarity. Lucia Rizzo was among the first. She left a letter under the tree. "You were never forgotten, Hermana. You lived in every prayer I said." Detective Monroe, now near retirement, declined interviews. He quietly cleaned out his desk, boxed up cold case files, and left a single photo pinned to the bulletin board. An aerial shot from Tyler Griggs's drone capturing the southern field in perfect symmetry. On the back of the photo, written in Monroe's scratchy hand, "The land remembers." Tyler Griggs, the land surveyor who found the sickle, was later approached by a documentary filmmaker. He agreed to an interview only once. "I just did my job," he said, "but maybe that's the point. If everyone had done theirs, maybe this wouldn't have happened." His drone footage, stitched with interviews and stills from the trial, formed the basis of a short film titled Beneath the Field. It would later go on to win a regional journalism award, not for its production, but for its reminder that silence is not neutral, it's permission. As autumn arrived in Mill Creek, the field turned gold once more. This time it didn't hide anything. It stood open, a space that had swallowed pain now reclaimed by memory and truth. And at the edge of it, on a bench carved with her name, Noah sat one morning watching the breeze move through the grain. He held a journal in his lap, not Annalise's, his, because her voice had been buried. But now it was his turn to write. Word count, 1006. The land where Annalise Carter once walked was no longer silent. By spring of the following year, the southern field had become a living memorial, a quiet, sprawling stretch of tall grass and prairie wildflowers. The newly planted tree, a red maple, stood at the heart of it, its leaves trembling gently in the morning breeze, casting dappled shadows on the bench where Noah Carter often sat in still reflection. The town of Mill Creek had changed, not outwardly, but underneath. What had once been a place where uncomfortable truths were buried now made space for remembrance, for growth, for reckoning. The memorial site, funded by both state grants and community donations, became a place where families came not just to honor Annalise and Carmen, but to face their own silences. School groups walked the path and paused at the plaque. Survivors of loss and violence tied white ribbons to the fence rails. Journalists and filmmakers respectfully told the story again and again, not to sensationalize, but to make sure it was never forgotten. And on that land, the field bloomed again. Inside the Carter farmhouse, life moved forward, tenderly but deliberately. Noah had taken over the property, renovating slowly, carefully. The once quiet halls now carried sound, the shuffle of feet, the clicking of old cabinets, the hum of a radio in the kitchen. Sometimes he found himself talking to Annalise as if she were just in the next room. He kept her room untouched except for the journal, now preserved in a glass case in the living room. Next to it, a framed photo of a young Carmen Rizzo, donated by her sister Lucia, rested on the mantel. "They never met in life," Noah once said in an interview, "but they kept each other alive as long as they could, and that means something." Detective Craig Monroe, officially retired, returned to the farmhouse only once, invited by Noah on a rainy Saturday morning. They shared coffee on the porch, listening to the rhythm of rain on the tin roof. Monroe spoke little. He looked older now, thinner, slower, but the spark in his eyes hadn't dimmed. "Some cases close in a file," he said, "some close in your chest." Noah handed him a small wooden box, the same one that once held Annalise's childhood trinkets. Inside, a folded page from her journal and a note from Noah. "You never stopped," it read. "Thank you for being the kind of man she deserved to have looking for her." Monroe didn't reply. He just nodded and tucked the box under his arm. That would be the last time Noah saw him. Elsewhere, Tyler Griggs, the land surveyor who had accidentally unearthed the truth, became something of a reluctant figure in town memory. He never sought fame, but accepted it with humility. His drone footage, paired with journal entries and courtroom sketches, had become the backbone of the award-winning short film Beneath the Field. The documentary wasn't flashy. It didn't sensationalize. It ended with a quiet, 10-second aerial shot of the field, the wind moving the tall grain as if Annalise were still walking through it. Tyler went back to his work, never leaving Mill Creek, but he never surveyed another plot near that southern field. "I found enough there for a lifetime," he once said. Lucia Rizzo visited the field every year on her sister's birthday. She would bring F. Lowers, a handwritten note, and sometimes a Spanish hymn that her grandmother used to sing. She forgave the town, eventually, not because they deserved it, but because Carmen would have wanted her to. She later founded the Rizzo Foundation, offering scholarships to young women in agriculture and migrant communities. In her speeches, she often said, "Carmen's life wasn't just taken, it was unfinished. This is how we finish it." In the fall of 2019, 22 years after Annalise vanished, a second bench was added to the memorial field across from Noah's. It bore a single phrase, carved in delicate script, "For the voices we nearly silenced, for the names we must always say." It stood as a reminder not just of the lives lost, but of the silence that allowed it. And so, the field that once kept its secrets now spoke with every breeze. Annalise Carter, Carmen Rizzo. Their names, once whispered in grief, were now spoken with clarity, with respect, with love. The case had ended, legally perhaps, but never entirely emotionally, because closure doesn't mean forgetting. It means continuing, in truth, in legacy, in what we teach the next generation. On the 25th anniversary of her disappearance, Noah Carter released a small self-published memoir titled The Quiet Field, A Brother's Story. It wasn't a bestseller, but it didn't need to be. It sat on shelves in local libraries, passed around book clubs, taught in high school ethics classes. One of the final lines read, "She was never gone, not really, because the field never forgot, and now neither will we." Closing scene. A young girl, maybe 10, walks with her parents along the field path. She stops at the edge, staring at the wildflowers blooming under the old red maple. A breeze moves her hair. "Who was Annalise?" she asks. Her mother kneels beside her, pointing to the plaque. "Someone who loved this land.
Someone who was lost, and someone we promise never to forget." The girl nods quietly. She looks back at the field, then whispers something to herself. Maybe a name, maybe a question. Then the family walks on. The camera lingers just a little longer, watching the field, golden, vast, no longer silent. Because some stories don't end. They settle in the soil and grow again.